I wasn't expecting the room to go quiet so quickly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here on a fantastic, another summer winter day in Naples. But a little louder, okay? First things first. Check your phones, please. Silence or off altogether. A reminder that the restrooms are in the back, across the hall, and if we were needed to leave this room quickly, the emergency exits are at the back of the room. So today we're delighted to be welcoming Ambassador William Taylor to address the membership. But first, I want to introduce a new good friend. We want to welcome Matthew Hughes, who is the almost 1 year President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, which is the umbrella organization that covers 90 councils all across the United States. Matthew, could you please stand up? Welcome. Some announcements. Enrollment for membership, including participation in our Great Decisions discussions, is open. Great Decisions begins the week of January 15th, so it's a great time to bring friends and new neighbors to join the organization. You can enroll, they can enroll either online or by calling our call center. Our next speaker will be coming to see us on Wednesday, another date away from our normal program of Mondays, but Wednesday, January 10th. And Radley Horton, who is a professor and principal investigator and climate scientist at Columbia University, is going to be talking about climate extremes, risks, and adaptation, very appropriately timed to the wrap of COP28 just a week or so ago. And now the Naples Council on World Affairs welcomes Ambassador Taylor for the third time in this last decade, and we really look forward to his remarks on the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Ambassador William B. Taylor is Vice President, Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He was appointed as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. He returned in 2019, serving as Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. Ambassador Taylor served during the Arab Spring, overseeing U.S. assistance and support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. He served in Jerusalem as the U.S. government's representative to the Mideast Quartet, and he has served in Kabul in 2002 and Baghdad in 2004. He's a graduate of West Point. He served on the ground, as he told me, in Vietnam, became a helicopter pilot, and subsequently went on to graduate from the Kennedy School of Government, preparing him extremely well for the challenges of his career. So please welcome Ambassador William B. Taylor. Ambassador.
Mark, thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Naples, for having me back. I feel like I've got some good friends here. Some of you people are probably saying, back again, you know, like a bad penny, but here we are. I am honored to be here, to be able to talk with you again. I am going to focus, of course, on Ukraine. There's a lot in the news today. Several months ago, we were focused solely on Ukraine. Now we're focused on the Middle East. And as Mark said, I've had some experience there as well a while ago. What I am hoping to do today is have 3 points that I will elaborate a little bit here. And then the second part is the part that I have mentioned to both Mark and Mimi several times, that is my favorite part of these kinds of interactions, is your questions, your comments, your arguments. You know, I'll probably say something, I hope I say something that someone in this room will disagree with. And that's the benefit to me of coming here to Naples to have this conversation. So I look forward to that part of the conversation. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you've got. The 3 points that I will start off with are, number one, kind of the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now. So I have mentioned that I have I've been back to Ukraine 5 times since February of 2022, when the Russians invaded full scope. And I'll be there again next month. I'll be back in January. I have a good sense, based on those visits, of what's going on there, on how the people feel, and how the military feels, and how the government's doing. And I'll say a little bit about that. The second point is what's going on in Washington. So I work in Washington now, and in Washington, the Congress and the Biden administration are thinking about how to support Ukraine going forward. And it's a debate, it's an argument. There's several different views of this. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But finally, my third point will be why I think we should care about what's going on in Ukraine. Why it's important to the United States, why it's important to people living in various, here in Naples, why it's important to Americans my own view is it's important that Ukraine win this war. And we'll talk about what winning means. But I think it's important that the Russians are stopped before they can do more damage. And the people that are stopping the Russians right now are the Ukrainians. And that's important to us for our own security, I will argue. For our own well-being, our own national security is tied up in this war that the Russians have started. So Matthew has, I can't see the screen. Oh, here's the screen, so I can barely see. So Matthew has a couple of maps. There's one map, all right. And I don't know if you can see these or not, but on the map, this gives you the sense right now, and I'm going to violate the rule of I'm not supposed to walk around here at all, but I will go back, Mimi, I promise. But in order to see the map, I have to be able to see this. So this is a map of Ukraine, obviously, and you can see Russia to the northeast, and you can see Romania and Poland to the west, and Belarus to the north. The part in red, of course, is what the Russians now occupy. So the Russians occupy about 20% of Ukraine, and that's shown in red. Now, some of you can see, if you're up close, that the parts outlined in black are what the Russians have occupied since 2014. And that brings up an important point. That is, the Russians first invaded in 2014. They invaded because they were worried. I say they, it's actually he, President Putin, was worried that the Ukrainians might somehow slip out of his grasp. He has for some time been focused, some would even say obsessed, with Ukraine. Thinking, writing, saying, speaking, that telling people that Ukraine's not really a country. Ukraine, for President Putin, is not a separate entity. It's really, as far as Putin is concerned, it's part of Russia. It's just part of Russia, and therefore, he says, we're just going to take it back. And when Ukraine was making moves toward joining Europe, which they were in 2014, Ukrainians had a debate about which way to go, back toward Russia or towards Europe. And this debate was going on when I was there the first time. Mark mentioned that I was there twice, and the first time was in 2006, 2009. It These are real debates. Ukraine's a real democracy. They have real debates and real decisions about which direction they want their country to go. And for a long time, it was a real debate between going to Russia. Some Ukrainians wanted to go towards Russia. Most wanted to go towards Europe. When the Ukrainians were about to take a serious step and sign a document, association agreement with the European Union in 2013, President Putin said, whoa, wait, stop. President Putin, don't want you, Ukraine, joining Europe. And so he went out of his way to first try to bribe the president of Ukraine, and then invade. It's gone now. Oh, here it is, it's back. Invade Crimea. To try to keep Ukraine under his control. This is what Putin has been after. This is what he continues to be after, so that, number one, he can reassemble the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, or number two, the other thing he's apparently very interested in is going down in Russian history as a great leader, a great Russian leader. He would like to put himself in the category of Peter the Great. Catherine the Great. He, unlike probably most people in this room, most people he would put Joe Stalin in that same group. Now, we probably have some concerns about Joe Stalin, but he doesn't. But the point is, President Putin, wants to be the Russian leader who gets Ukraine back. So, invades in 2014. Then there's a low-level war along that line, the line between the occupied part and the rest of Ukraine. I'm going to come back to this, but the rest of Ukraine is 80% that is not occupied by Russia. It's bombarded. It gets bombed a lot. But the Russian troops, the Russian occupying forces, are only in this red part. But he would like to take the whole country. President Putin would like to take the whole country. And he tried to do that from 2014 to 2022. He was failing. And Ukraine was making motions again to join the European Union. It had also indicated Ukraine was interested in joining NATO. President Putin decided that was not going to happen, and he invaded with 200,000 troops and all the tanks that he could muster on February 24th, 2022. So that then set the stage for Ukraine to decide if it was going to fight back, and it did. And it was led by, as we know, President Zelensky, their president, who inspired Ukrainians by staying in the capital. He was not going to be run off. He inspired his soldiers. Zelensky has mentioned that had he left Kyiv, the capital, when the Russians were bearing down on the capital. So in February and March of 2022, the Russians were just outside of the capital. They had assassination squads in the capital looking for Zelensky. Because, again, they thought they would just get rid of Zelensky, put a puppet in, and take over the country. That was their game plan. It was a bad plan. It didn't work because, why didn't it work? The Ukrainians pushed back. Putin must have been surprised that the Ukrainians pushed back so hard. And this was really before there was a lot of assistance coming from NATO or the United States. This was the Ukrainians using what they had, including some very good intelligence, by the way. Everybody knows Bill Burns, the head of our CIA. He went to Ukraine before the invasion with some very good intelligence, some very good information about what the Russians were planning. Many people didn't believe it. One of my visits before the war was just before the invasion, about 3 weeks before the invasion. Bill Burns had already been there, had told both the intelligence and the leadership that the Russians have a serious plan to invade, Bill Burns told them. People did not want to believe it because they just couldn't believe that the Russians would do something that they saw rightly would be stupid. And it was the Russians wouldn't do that. And the French and the Germans were saying, don't believe the Americans. Don't believe the Americans, And President Putin and his foreign minister, Minister Lavrov, were saying, invade? We're not going to invade. What do you mean? It's the Americans being hysterical. They're trying to work. We're not going to invade. So the Ukrainians wanted to believe that, and I had a conversation with President Zelensky in January of 2022, 3 weeks before the invasion. He knew it was a possibility, and he was taking some measures to prepare, but in his gut, he didn't think it was going to happen. Well, obviously it did. They got close. He stayed there. He stayed in the capital, didn't leave, even though he was invited to take a safer route, a safer place in the southwestern part of the country. Didn't do it. He stayed. And they have fought amazingly since then with our help. Now this gets to the key part. The Ukrainians recognize that our help, military, financial, economic, diplomatic, political, our help has been key. The U.S., I'll just say this, the U.S. help has been key. Europeans have stood up as well. Europeans have provided some weapons. We have the ability, the Americans have the ability to do more on the weapons side just because we have bigger stockpiles. We have bigger stockpiles that we can dig into and get stuff, military stuff, to the Ukrainians right away. Whereas the Europeans have fewer of that, but they are stepping up with their economic support and their military support as well. In fact, it's just an interesting point. While we provide the bulk of the military, the Europeans step up, in particular on the financial side, to keep the Ukrainian government going, which they need. The Russian bombing of Ukraine has reduced its economy by about a third. We talk about a recession where growth goes negative for a little bit, for a couple of quarters, and it goes down a percentage or two. Their economy has gone down 35%. 35%. So it's devastating, the effect of the Russian attacks on Ukraine. But the 80% is still kind of functioning, even though it's subject to attack every day. Europeans are helping on that. We're helping on the financial side too. Europeans are helping on the military side. We have, as I say, more stocks to be able to provide them. The Ukrainians understand that without that support, they couldn't do what they have done for the past 665 days. It's been 665 days that they have held off the Russians. And they continue to do it. The last thing I'll say about the current situation is that the front line, Matthew, maybe we can show the map again. The front line there, the line between the red part and the white part of Ukraine, hasn't changed much in about a year. A year ago, it changed a lot because you would have seen red all the way to Kyiv and all the way on the northeastern part of the map. Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, all of that was red until last fall when a counteroffensive, the Ukrainian counteroffensive, pushed them all back. The counteroffensive pushed it back to there. But since about a year, for about the past year, that map's been pretty constant. It hadn't changed much. It's not to say there's not serious fighting, because both sides are attacking the others. Both sides are trying to break through, and neither side can do it. My last trip in October, I had a good conversation with the commander-in-chief. The supreme commander-in-chief, of course, is President Zelensky, but the commander-in-chief, the senior uniformed leader, is a man named Zaluzhny, and General Zaluzhny was talking about this static line, about neither side being able to break through. And for the military people in the room, it was interesting to hear him say, General Zaluzhny say, that the tank is now, he says, obsolete. He says that the armored vehicles, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, obsolete. Why? Two things. One is these drones are able to spot concentrations of armor, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that are trying to mass and try to break through. And these drones can spot that on both sides. The Ukrainians can see what the Russians are about to do. The Russians can see what the Ukrainians are about to do. Both sides learned this lesson the hard way. The Ukrainians back in June tried to mount a counteroffensive, and many people will have heard about this vaunted counteroffensive that a lot of people were hoping would actually break through. Didn't, because of what General Zaluzhny said. That is, they can see each other. They can see each other through the intelligence and the drones. But the second thing is accurate fires, very precise fires that can take out tanks. Drones, in particular, can drop incendiary and other kinds of explosives on tanks from right above. So this is to say that neither side can break through at this point. So then the question is, where do we go? What happens? Is it doomed to be a stalemate, to be a deadlock, even a violent deadlock? Or is it possible for one side or the other to make a change? And Zaluzhny had an answer to that too. He said, he's an interesting fellow, this man, General Zaluzhny. He said, I met him, by the way, in his office. His office in Kyiv was in the Olympic Stadium. There's an Olympic soccer stadium, football stadium. And they chose it, I guess, because there are many levels of parking below the stadium. And in order to visit General Zaluzhny, you have to go down to, and it's pretty secure down in there. But the waiting room, the place that I was waiting in order to go before I went to see him, looked right out on the pitch. But then when I got into his office, he was there, had all his books, and very smart, a historian, a military historian. And not just of kind of recent history. He pulled out a couple of books written by Soviets or Russians after World War I, talking about this stalemate. He had done some kind of historical thinking about this. But he said that in order to break through, in order to get out of this deadlock that he acknowledges is the current situation, one side or the other is going to have a breakthrough. And he then said, when the Chinese, stick with me here, when the Chinese invented gunpowder centuries ago, that changed the nature of warfare. After that, things changed a lot from before that. And Zaluzhny said that technology is the new gunpowder. He said technology is going to allow one side or the other to get an advantage over the other. And it's drone technology, it's anti-counter drone technology, it's electronic warfare, not very sexy or interesting, but electronic warfare is a big deal. And counter electronic warfare can stop drones and can mess up communications. And can mess up the guidance systems that the military needs. So that technology, all of that, is going to be really important. And General Zaluzhny says that if we can provide, if the Americans and the Europeans provide this next generation of jets, these F-16 jets, has very advanced technology, has long-range radar, has long-range weapons mounted on them. That could help. Not a silver bullet, but that could help. And the long-range fires, the long-range missiles, these are called ATACMS. They're called the Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS. And they go 300 kilometers. And General Zaluzhny says if they get that kind of technology, then it is possible to degrade the Russian occupation forces with the possibility then that they could make some progress. If they make some progress, then the Ukrainians General Zaluzhny thinks, and President Zelensky thinks, that they can push the Russians out of the country. That's their goal. The Ukrainians have no interest in going into Russia. They have no interest in marching on Moscow. This is not what they're, no, all they want is to get the Russians out of the country. And they think if we provide them with the tools, that they can do that. So that's kind of, now, if we don't, there's another scenario here, and the scenario is if we don't provide them this, there's another possibility, and that is this stalemate, this deadlock continues, and the Russians continue to occupy 20% of Ukraine. They continue to fight across the line. The Ukrainians will somehow take that 80% that is not occupied, still vulnerable to attacks, take that 80% and try to move on. Try to move on to the European Union. Try to move on to NATO. I mean, they remember that there was a couple of historicals that we remember. North Korea, South Korea, where there wasn't a treaty, there wasn't an agreement, there wasn't a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire, but there wasn't an agreement to solve that problem. That continues. Or East Germany, West Germany, where West Germany went on to join the EU, form and join the EU, was a early member of NATO, even while East Germany was controlled by the Soviets. So the West German model is one. Ukrainians, I will tell you, are not interested in either of those models. That's not their goal. They're not there yet, and they don't want to negotiate for that. They want to push the Russians out. And when people say, "Well, why don't you just negotiate with the Russians?" And there are Americans who have said that. Nobody in the U.S. government, but there are American analysts and thinkers who have said, Ukrainians, you can't win. You just can't win. So why don't you just compromise? Work something out with Putin. Stop the war, And the Ukrainians say no. They say no. Why? Because not only is that 20% of their country, it's also 20% of their people. And they know what happens to Ukrainians who live in towns and villages that Russians occupy, and it's terrible. It's war crimes. It's atrocities. And the Ukrainians are not willing to give that up. They're not willing to make that possible. So that's where we are right now. Not too long now, we're going to get to your part of this conversation, and we'll have some conversations, talk about this. I'd love to answer questions about this. Let me just say quickly, in Washington, we're debating, the United States, our Congress, are debating whether or not and when to provide this assistance that I was just talking about. If we provide the assistance, the Ukrainians have a shot. If we don't provide the assistance, if we get tired, if our support fades, they don't really have a shot. And then they'll have to settle for something else that we just described. So it's an important debate. It's an important discussion. And the United States Senate is at work right now. The House of Representatives is not at work. They've gone home for the holidays. But the Senate is still there, and they are trying. The complicating factor, I'm not telling something that no one, you all know this, the complicating factor is immigration reform. There are people in particular in the House of Representatives, but also in the Senate, who say, look, we're not going to vote for assistance to Ukraine or Israel, by the way, until and unless a big agreement can happen on immigration reform, border security, southern border security. And that's what they're talking about now. They're not talking about assistance to Ukraine. Assistance to Ukraine is supported bipartisan in the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats. If you had a vote on assistance to Ukraine in the Senate, it would pass 4-1. Most senators are strong support of Ukraine, and they'll pass that. In the House, it's more complicated, and there are some who oppose assistance to Ukraine, not many, but some. And then there are more who won't pass assistance to Ukraine unless there's this border deal. But if you got a vote on assistance to Ukraine in the House, it would pass 3-1, Republicans and Democrats. So the point is that's not the issue in Washington right now. The issue in Washington right now is some kind of a deal, agreement, compromise on border security. And once they get that, they'll package it together with this assistance to Ukraine and Israel, and it will likely pass. I think it will pass. Maybe not this year, maybe in January. likely in January. But that's what's going on in Washington. My last point, and then we'll get to questions. You can help me. Why do we care? Why do we care if the Ukrainians win or lose on this? I think there are several reasons. One is for the World Affairs Council people who kind of think in these terms. There is a world order that prevailed in Europe and the rest of the world as well since the end of World War II. And in this order, a characteristic of this order were agreement on principles of sovereignty. States, nations are sovereign, and they have borders, and borders are to be respected. Sovereignty and territorial integrity are two of the principles that kept us out of a big war in Europe for some 69 years until the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014. If we want to go back to, if we want the world to be more stable, if we want to go back to an order where sovereignty is respected, where borders are respected, then the Russians have to get out of Ukraine. The Russians cannot be allowed to grab 20% of their neighboring country and still expect for other nations, much less the Russians, to agree to some order, to return to some order. So in order to have a more stable, safe, secure world for us and our children and our grandchildren, there needs to be a resolution in favor of the Ukrainians to get the Russians out of their country. So that's kind of the World Affairs Council first piece. The World Affairs Council folks, you will also appreciate the second, and that is, if the Russians take over Ukraine, they will be smack up against NATO. They're already smack up against NATO in the Baltic states, in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. And now Finland, by the way. We can talk about Finland, but Finland saw what was going on. They've been neutral for centuries, decades. And when they saw the Russians invade Ukraine, they said neutrality clearly doesn't work. And we, Finns and Swedes, would like to join NATO. And the Finns are now in NATO. So there's another long border between NATO and Russia. And if the Russians take over Ukraine, then Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria will be smack up against. And the Russians, as the Finns know, and as the Poles know, don't stop. I say the Finns and the Poles and the other East Europeans who have lived next to the Russians for 300 years. And for 300 years, the Russians have been expanding into their next neighbors. And the Finns and the Poles and Czechs and Slovaks, Hungarians, they know this. And so that's why they're in NATO. And if the Russians take over Ukraine and they are smack up against it, then we, NATO members, are implicated. They are vulnerable, we are vulnerable. Right now, there are no American soldiers in Ukraine, none. There are a couple of Marines at the embassy. There are no combat soldiers, and there won't be. Ukrainians are not asking for soldiers. The Ukrainians are asking for the tools to allow them to stop the Russians. And if they stop the Russians, then NATO is more secure, and we are less likely, much less likely, to have our soldiers fight the Russians. So that's the second. So there's a kind of strategic issue, geostrategic. There's a national security. The last one, and then I will stop. The last reason I think we should care, and this is a reason that many people around the world care, is that it's a moral argument. So the Russians have committed horrible crimes. President Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court as a war criminal. So he can't travel because he's indicted. He can't travel to countries that are part of that treaty. What he's indicted for is kidnapping Ukrainian children and taking them into Russia and trying to make them Russian citizens. But he's also, as we know, and we've seen what happened in Bucha, in Irpin, where the Russian soldiers went in, massacred Ukrainians, assassinated, raped, tortured. It's horrible. And those crimes, as well as the overall crime, the crime that Putin committed when he decided to invade his neighbor, that's the crime of aggression. And all these other crimes, these atrocities, these war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, those are all subsequent and subordinate crimes. But the original crime is the decision that Putin made to invade his neighbor, and there needs to be accountability because of the moral aspect of this. And if there's not accountability, and if Putin is allowed to get away with this, then others will see that. Other dictators, other authoritarians will see, A, you can take part of your neighbor's country, B, you don't pay a price. And that means we're in a bad place. That means we're in a world that we don't want our kids and grandchildren to live in. That's why I think it's important that we do this, that we support them. And if we do support them, if we support the Ukrainians, they can win. It's not easy. They will continue to fight it. But the other part of that is also true. That is, if we don't, they won't. They won't be able to win without this. So that's my argument. I would love to hear your thoughts. I imagine there are people that would disagree with something that I said here. All right, Mark, you're going to help me with this? Okay.
They're lining up already.
Right. Excellent.
They're lining up. So for those of you who are online, please type in your questions under the Q&A function, and we'll make sure that we get your questions taken care of also. So please.
Thank you.
It is, or at least I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Can others hear? Yeah, okay, right.
All right. I'm encouraged that you think this deal will go through in January.
In Washington. We're talking about the
in
White House.
Washington, yes, in Washington. That's encouraging news given what we've been reading in the paper. However, my real question is, how concerned are you if there is a change of administration in Washington that all of this is for naught, and that a 4-1 in the Senate and a 3-1 in the House of Representatives counts for nothing?
So we don't know. It's a year off. No one knows what the outcome of any election will be a year off. Nor can I say, I mean, maybe people have a good sense of what either of the two potential likely candidates would do. We know what President Biden would do. I mean, that's clear. We don't know who's going to be the Republican, but we have a pretty good chance indication of who that. But we don't really know what the policy would be. But your question is right. Your question is a question that Ukrainians and Europeans, by the way, are very concerned about. When I travel, both to Europe and in particular to Ukraine, I get the question that you just asked all the time. And they're worried. And they listen very carefully, the Ukrainians. They listen to the debates. They listen to what's happening on the Senate floor. I will get questions from my Ukrainian friends that I'm in touch with daily who say, we were listening, we were reading about what happened on the Senate floor yesterday, and they said this. What do you think? So they're listening very carefully, and they're worried about this because they know how important it is for the United States to. Short answer is, I don't know what's going to happen in a year. If, however, if support for NATO is removed or declines, that's a real problem. We won't be able to exert the kind of leadership that we've done. And if the support to Ukraine is reduced or flagged or eliminated by some new administration, Ukrainians are in real trouble. The Ukrainians, I've said it before, President Zelensky has said it. Without our support, they can't win. They will have to settle for something else. So that's as much as I can say. Sir.
Well, John Kelly and John Bolton have made it pretty clear that Trump intends to withdraw from NATO, and we know very clearly that Trump will pull the rug out from under Ukraine if he wins, and the chances are looking quite positive there. I guess my question is, what happens to Europe at that point if you have a rump European NATO? Putin will then actually have a nuclear oversight of Europe, which will vastly change the whole European continent. So what will happen with European NATO? Putin, would he move into Moldova, Georgia, Armenia? And at the same time, Xi Jinping is chomping at the bit here. He would move very quickly, I assure you. Yeah.
Totally agree. Totally agree. If we pull out NATO, if we reduce our assistance to Ukraine, that gives Putin a free ride, open opportunity to take over Ukraine. The countries you mentioned in this kind of gray zone, the Moldovans, the Georgians, Belarus, of course, is already basically gone. But that just makes my earlier point even more strong. That is, with Russian control of all of that part of Eastern Europe, the possibility of a conflict with NATO just goes way up. That's a problem. You mentioned President Xi. He's watching very closely, undoubtedly. If President Putin is allowed to win, if we fail to provide the assistance that they need, the Ukrainians, then President Xi notices and says, well, the Americans, they don't have the stomach. That's what he's been saying for a long time, that the Americans are in decline and China is on the rise. And this will be more evidence that he will use, and a bigger possibility that he goes into Taiwan. I agree with your analysis.
Don't forget
Please.
That Hungary is in bed with Putin. So is Slovakia. Netherlands is moving in that direction. Even Sweden has had a big shift. There's a tremendous rise in the AfD in Germany. So would this begin to pull Europe into Putin's web?
That's the worry. That's exactly the worry. I would say that the Germans have stepped up in the last month or so.
Yeah.
The Germans have, and it might be in response to the question that you asked, and that is, the Germans are a bit worried if the Americans aren't there, if the Americans are not there to provide the leadership, not to mention the resources, then they have to face Putin without the Americans, and they need to step up, and they are. The Germans are now the second largest provider of weapons, well after us, but nonetheless they're moving in that direction. Thank you, sir. Good questions.
Hi. Well, you've just given us a really good narrative for starting World War III. So I hate to spoil your party, but I basically disagree with almost everything you've just said over the past hour.
Please, go ahead.
When you were introduced, it was mentioned that you were in Vietnam.
Yes.
So was I.
Good.
Okay? So you remember what the domino theory is. The reason we were in Vietnam was because if Vietnam fell, so would Cambodia, and so would Thailand, and so would Laos. It never happened. What you're telling us now is if Ukraine falls, so will Bulgaria and Moldova and Poland. I don't buy that argument for a minute.
Good, fine. You don't have to.
That's one thing.
Very good. What's
Number
the second
two.
one?
Just recently, somebody in the administration, which I despise completely, everybody in that administration is, I don't even want to say it, okay, but I'll tell you this.
Yep.
Just recently, maybe it was Chuck Schumer who said it.
He was not in the administration, but
No, but
good.
he's-
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It may have been Kamala. I don't know who it was.
Okay.
But what was said was, if we don't give more aid to Ukraine, another $50 billion,
Or 61 is what they're
if we don't
proposed,
if we don't give them that money, then American troops will have to go to Ukraine. That was said. It was in the papers, it was on TV, that the alternative to giving them more money is we send troops over there. Another reason for World War III, okay? the people behind this whole story goes back to 2014. And the head of that whole process, of that revolution that took place in Ukraine, 2014, it's called the Maidan Revolution, right?
Euromaidan, yes.
Yeah, the main
It was
architect.
called the Revolution of Dignity, and we can say why.
The main architect of that whole deal was Victoria Nuland.
No, come
Yeah,
on.
Yeah,
no.
Victoria Nuland, who talked us into Iraq, talked us into Afghanistan.
So it's the Americans' fault.
And
It's
talked,
the Americans' fault.
And talked
All
us
right.
into
Let's
a
have a
revolution
question.
No,
in the
this
Ukraine.
is fine. This is
That's
fine.
all.
No,
No,
that's
okay,
fine.
I'm
That's
done.
good.
Would like a question.
I'm done.
No, you're right. No, but sir, let me
no,
just
so-
say a couple
yeah,
things.
please answer
Let-
his
yeah,
points.
it's a fair point. You're not the first person to raise this concern. First of all, on that last point about the Ukrainians or Victoria Nuland, whom I know well, the Ukrainians get all the credit for standing up to Putin. The Ukrainians get all the credit for running off their Russia-oriented president. That was not any Americans. This was not. So the Ukrainians have stood up for themselves, and that gets back to your first point, which is what we are doing is we are trying to enable the Ukrainians to defend themselves. It's very clear who invaded whom. The Russians wanted to, and still want to control Ukraine. The Ukrainians are sticking up for themselves, are defending themselves, have held off the Russians for 665 days, and we've helped them. We've helped them. Your point about dominoes is a good one. It's a good one. There are analogies in there that apply and analogies that don't. And the domino theory back then when you and I were in Vietnam, you're right, that it didn't fall. And the question though is in Europe is not that it's inevitable that these dominoes will fall. The question is the probability of a conflict between NATO and Russia higher or lower with the Russians taking over Ukraine? And the argument is the probabilities are much lower if Ukraine is free and independent, and indeed part of NATO. So that's the argument. It's not either give them the 61 billion or we send American soldiers. I mean, I can't believe anybody really said that, but I take your point that you saw it on the TV somewhere. I don't think it was the administration, but I don't think anybody really believes that this 61 billion is in contrast to, or it will happen if we send troops. Sir.
General Leland.
The subject is corruption.
Corruption.
It's been a problem in Ukraine. And I'd just be interested in your perspective, the first time you were there versus the second time you were there, kind of what your insights are into what it is now and how that compares with the United States, other large democracies.
Thank you, General. Yes, thank you, General. Corruption is a big issue, and it's the right question to ask. It's one of the many questions to ask. And you're right about that question should be asked to a lot of countries, including ours. I have many conversations with Ukrainians about this issue, in both times. Both when I was there the first time and second time, and I get asked about corruption, and I say that in the United States, you can't go to any town, city, state in the United States and pick up the local paper without finding some story about some local council member, senator. I can think of a senator in New Jersey, just to pick one, that has, or governor. I can think of some governors in Illinois, for example. You can't go anywhere where there's not some official who's either accused of, on trial for, or in jail for corruption. So just to be clear, what I tell my Ukrainian friends, however, is the difference between the United States and Ukraine is at least up until recently is in the United States, we put those people in jail, and the Ukrainians didn't. They had a hard time. Now, in answer to your question, is it changing? turns out the answer is yes. It turns out the answer is yes. Gentleman asked about the Revolution of Dignity back in 2014. The Revolution of Dignity was in response, was a Ukrainian people's grassroots response to a lot of problems, including corruption. The kind of Russian-oriented, Russian-leaning Ukrainian president, a guy named Yanukovych, who was the Ukrainian president from 2010 to 2014, and he was the cause of the Revolution of Dignity, was super corrupt. Corrupt in terms of finances, but also he allowed the Ukrainian military, you will appreciate it, to be hollowed out, to be corrupted itself. So this was a corrupt person, and the Ukrainians revolted against that, rose up. And the years after that, from 2014 to 2019, when Zelensky was elected, the Ukrainians put in place a new whole system to deal with corruption, established new courts and new prosecutors, new investigators. And as you know, the Transparency International does an evaluation, does a ranking of perceptions of corruption around the world. And Ukraine used to be like 167 out of 200. Not good. They were 20 above the Russians, who were like, 187. But 167 is not something to be proud of. That was in 2014. They are now at 116. Still not great, but a big improvement. You don't see that kind of jump in improvement in the perception, positive perception of going in the right direction on corruption. They have taken steps. They know they've got a problem. President Zelensky knows he's got a problem. I don't know if I mentioned here, but there have been, during the war, there was a deputy minister of defense who was responsible for buying food for soldiers. And the Ukrainians have a very good press corps, very aggressive reporters. And the one reporter went out and he found a contract between the Ministry of Defense and food suppliers. And he knew, he could see what the Ministry of Defense was paying for eggs. And this reporter then went out to the market and bought some eggs and noticed that the Ministry of Defense was paying twice as much. There was corruption there. There was a scam there. And it blew the whistle, and the press covered it. President Zelensky fired that guy. And they found the same thing on the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was caught by one of these new institutions, the anti-corruption institutions that I mentioned they put in place, taking bribes. Got rid of him. He's in jail. So this is all to say, a good question, a concern. The Ukrainians know they've got a problem. They've been doing something about a problem. It's shown some results. They know they've got more to do.
An online question.
Online question. All right.
Yes. So
This young man just accepted to Princeton, by the way, I will say.
So one of the online questions was, what specific actions should the U.S. take to enable Ukraine to win rather than merely prolong the war?
Great question. Thank whoever asked that question. Write your congressmen and senators and ask them. The answer is the United States needs to support the Ukrainians in this effort to provide them the assistance that they need. That's the one thing that right now will make the difference, because in that, and it's actually 61 billion. It's more than the 50, but just in that 61, I should describe this a little bit. The 61 billion. So we provide these weapons and ammunition from our stockpiles, from our DoD, Ministry of our Defense stockpiles. So we've got big stockpiles of ammunition for howitzers, 155 millimeter howitzers. And we take rounds, ammunition from that stockpile and send it to the Ukrainians. The money that the Congress is appropriating, so this 61 billion and the previous that had been appropriated, goes to replenish those stockpiles. So what's actually happening is the money goes to places in like Pennsylvania that manufacture, American companies that manufacture weapons for the United States military. That's where the money goes. Money does not go to Ukraine. Money does not go to Ukraine. Money goes to U.S. manufacturers, U.S. jobs. There are workers at these tank plants, artillery plants that are working around the clock because of the support that we're giving to the Ukraine. So that's where the money goes. But that's the answer to the question is we need to provide the Ukrainians with the tools they need so that they can win. And they are defending us, they're defending themselves, and they're defending Europe.
Ambassador Taylor, you outlined pretty well why we have to win from our point of view, from the West's point of view, from Ukraine's point of view. So what does it look like for Russia if Ukraine wins? What is the expectation? What's Putin going to do? What's Russia going to do?
Well, that's a great question. It's not one I worry about, I will tell you. Not because I don't think let me be clear. I think the Ukrainians can win. And so Putin should worry about that. But I don't worry about what his reaction would be. So we've done a little bit of thinking about that exact question. And if the Ukrainians win, if the Ukrainians push the Russians out of their country, it's bad for Putin. It's very bad. It's bad for Putin. In Russian history and Soviet history, Russian and Soviet leaders don't last very long once they lose a war. And that's what we're really talking about. So he could lose it. And the way it could happen is people lose confidence in Putin. People right around him, probably not, the mass demonstrations in the streets. Russians are not able to. I mean, he's got such control, he can keep Russians from going to the streets. But people around him in his National Security Council and other immediate subordinates lose confidence in him if he loses, if Ukrainians win, it isn't your question. And they say, they come to him and they say, Mr. President, we have this dacha for you here just outside of Moscow. We'll take care of your family. We've got this. That could happen. That could happen.
That'd be interesting.
That should be
I hope
interesting.
that happens.
Thank you.
Hi. When you talked about the stalemate that's going on right now,
Yep.
and the way that the U.S. could supply the next tier of technology,
Yep.
where is Russia in that next tier of technology?
It's a great question.
Are we just going to be in another stalemate, or are they further ahead than even we are?
They're not further ahead than we are, but you're exactly right. That's what's been going on, actually. The Ukrainians try something, in particular on drones. The Ukrainians got out front really on drones. The Russians have caught up. And some even say the Russians now, because they are bigger, someone mentioned the size of the Russian economy is much larger than the Ukrainian economy. Just on that point, the Russians don't have many allies that can help them. The only places they can buy these weapons are North Korea and Iran. Whereas the Ukrainians have the support of all of Europe and all of the United States. The ratio between the Ukrainian supporters in Ukraine compared to Russian supporters and Russia is 20-1. So the Ukrainians can count on that kind of economic support. If they can count on that economic support, then they can more than match the Russians. But you're right, the Russians don't stand still. They try to develop this technologies as well, and they have. They're actually ahead of the Ukrainians on electronic warfare. The Ukrainians know that, and they're trying to deal with that. But the other thing that you're right about is the Russian response to any opportunity. So the Ukrainians were talking about a counteroffensive all last spring, starting in the late winter, all last spring. And they couldn't do it for various reasons, including not having the equipment and the training that they thought they needed. So they didn't get started until June. January to June, the Russians, exactly what your question is, the Russians took advantage of that time, dug in incredible defenses, and put in very dense minefields up and down and very deep So this is not easy. No, your question is a good one. Go ahead, please.
And would there be a hesitancy on the part of the West or the other European nations to not want to divulge what their new technology is, so they'll hold back?
So far, no. I mean, I should not say that. So far, that has been a consideration, less for the Europeans, more for us. In particular, at the beginning, we were slow to provide some of these weapons that we talked about here in terms of the anti-tank, the anti-aircraft, the longer-range artillery, the tanks, the F-16s. We were slow to make these decisions, partly because of a concern about not divulging the kind of technologies we got. But I think we've gotten over it and concluded that there's no reason to save this. This is the war. This is the war that we need to help the Ukrainians win. And so we're providing them now. We've made the decisions, hard decisions and slow decisions. We've made the decisions to provide these weapons more and more sophisticated, all the way up to these very long-range missiles that could go 160 kilometers. There's one more range that we could add to make it 300 kilometers. But we've made those decisions, even though we know that the technology is embedded in there.
As far as your knowledge, if we really, really committed and set the newest and the best of the best, could they not wipe them out much faster and get them out of there?
Wipe them out, they could succeed. And practice only if we do that. Both the qualitative, the best of the best that you say, but also in the numbers that they need. So we've given them some of these long-range missiles that I mentioned, and that's kind of the best of the best that is there. We have some newer technology that we're developing. We haven't fielded yet, we haven't put into our units yet, but we have some that's coming along. There's some newer ones which we haven't done yet. But right now they're getting them, but we're not getting them to the Ukrainians in the numbers that they need to do that. But the short answer to your question is yes. If it's the quality and the quantity that they need, they can push them out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is similar to this last lady's question.
Yeah.
And that is there the will in our legislative and particularly our executive branch to supply the highest quality weapons without castrating them like we've done before in terms of the range, and telling them you can't hit behind the Russian border with them so they can get to the supply lines? Is there the will and the recognition that this slow process we've been doing is what's got us to this stalemate that we are now? In other words, is there the will to supply the right 61 billion, not the dumb munitions we've been giving them so far, something to decisively end this war quickly?
I think it's emerging, it's dawning. That understanding is coming to people in the administration and in the Congress, that what we've done so far has been slow. And what we've done so far is to hold back some of the technologies that we've talked about, and but they've finally made those decisions. And is the will there? You're asking the right question, because that is going to be the key. My sense is that the critique from the opposition, from the Republicans, the strong critique is that one. That is, you've gone, by the administration, you've gone too slow. You have not given the Ukrainians what they need. If you did, they would be able to succeed. And I think the Biden administration is understanding that.
Is there a will in the legislative branch to actually
We will see.
push them to
We
give
will
these
see.
latest weapons?
It's a right question. So again, going back to it's the right question, but we will see probably in the next month, when the Congress comes back, they will decide on a compromise. And if there's a compromise on the border security and on immigration reform, that's important to a lot of people. Ukraine is important to a lot of people, and Ukraine's really important, I think, to both Republicans and Democrats who want to see Russia defeated. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you, Ambassador. A question. You know, we have heard in the past about the morale problems with the Russian army. And I'm wondering if you can tell us about that, because we've heard problems that has been very low morale. Some of them have deserted, and that Putin has had to up the age requirements to gain more people in his army. Can you just tell us the landscape of that right now?
Be glad to. And I will say that, yes, the Russians do have a morale problem. They've been fighting for 665 days as well. They've, as you know, they've had to go to convicts. I mean, they've gone through prisons and have promised convicts to pardons if they go fight in Ukraine if they last 6 months, which doesn't lead to high morale on either the professional soldiers or the convicts. So they've had that problem. There have been many reports in the press, both of desertions, as you say, but also of conversations between soldiers on the front line talking to family back in Russia. And so there's some evidence of that. I will say, however, that the Ukrainians have maybe not quite the same level of that problem. They haven't gone to convicts, for example, but they are also, they've been fighting 665 days. They've, without much rotation in and out. So the Ukrainian morale is also under pressure. The difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians is the Ukrainians know why they're fighting. The Ukrainians are fighting for their community, for their family, for their land, for their culture, for their existence. They are fighting. If they lose, the Ukrainians know this. The Ukrainians know this. If they lose, there's no Ukraine. So it's literally existential for them. And that gives them a morale advantage. It gives them a moral advantage, but it gives them a morale advantage as well. So, but let's be clear, they're both tired. And morale applies to the whole country. The country has really mobilized, in some real sense, the Ukrainians, to support their troops and the volunteers. There are drone manufacturers in every little community, a lot of houses. People are just working constantly to support the Ukrainian military, providing other kinds of support, military as well as food support. They're tired too, but they know why they're fighting. They will not give up. They do polls of the Ukrainians as well, not so much on the Russian side, but they do ask Ukrainians how they're doing, and they're tired. But they're not ready to give up. They're not ready to negotiate. They're not ready to cede territory.
We have our Princeton-bound NCAA scholarship
All right.
winner also. So another question from online, please.
Yeah, I was definitely very grateful to receive that scholarship. It was very helpful in my applications and furthering my understanding of issues like this. So another question from online is, what are the odds that at this point Ukraine will settle for 80% as a way to peace?
I think the odds right now are pretty low that the Ukrainians will settle for that 80% solution. The reason I mentioned this earlier, that the Ukrainians see that 20% as 20% of their people, citizens, Ukrainian citizens, that would be relegated to Russian control. And so when I've been in Ukraine, as I say, Ukraine a bunch over the past 2 years, and I would have conversations about the last thing that I mentioned about why we should care and what, the geostrategic issues of why it's important that Ukraine win, as well as the security that to lower the probabilities that there will be a war between NATO and Russia, the moral aspects of this, having that conversation. And one of the Ukrainian ministers, a young man actually, who had been on the Maidan in the Revolution of Dignity, he said, I've known him for some time. He said, Bill, we're talking about these big reasons why the West should care, why the Americans should care, why we have to win this. But he said, if you go out on the street of Kyiv, where we were, and he said, you ask Ukrainians why they're fighting, and they will tell you because they won't live under Russia. They've lived under Russia before, and they know what happens in this war about when they are occupied. And the horrors that entails. But they also know that they've lived under Russian control one way or the other for a long time, for centuries, and it's not been happy for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians remember, many people, all Ukrainians remember the big famine in 1932 and 1933. Most people in the rest of the world have never heard of this famine, but this was a man-made famine. This was Joseph Stalin, who created a famine, intentionally caused a famine in Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union, but focused on Ukraine, that killed 4 million people. 4 million Ukrainians died of starvation. They have a name for it in Ukrainian. It's called the Holodomor, which is death by starvation. And this is seared into Ukrainian memory. This is all to say that the Ukrainians have been free, living free since 1991 of the Russian control, Soviet control, and they won't go back.
One
Sir.
more question.
Yeah, okay. I'd like to make a question just about the unity of the Ukrainians as a people and how that relates to the resources we would have to use to break through the present stalemate. I mean, there's a way that you could make an argument, and you've heard it and I've heard it, that we've got to a point that the cost of breaking through would be so great that it would be counterproductive in terms of resources we would have to use and the number of deaths. And they would also point out that if you look at the results of the elections in Ukraine, and I've done polling all over the world on this, that the place where the Russians are now, those people voted for the more pro-Russian areas. So a lot of those people are basically more Russian. Now, obviously what Putin's done to them is not going to make them pro-Russian, but you know, you could make a very good argument that if we could save Ukraine rather than defeat Russia, save the 20%, that might serve as a deterrent to people like Xi. Now, you know, the question is the resources we have. I know the last 2 games in the Pentagon to defend Taiwan, we lost. And I know that there's all the problems we have now in the Middle East. And then, of course, we've got, you know, the inner cities of the United States, $30 trillion in debt. And we've got a big problem. I've got 2 grandsons that are officers in the military now, and they're both telling me that their units that they're in are 30% down, that they can't get people to volunteer to go into them. And if you know, that if we actually did get a fight in, it's hard to know whether we'd have the resources to continue it. So anyway, you know, you've heard that line of, because it's not a crazy line of thinking. It comes out of a lot of the people that you know, and maybe some of the ones I know in Washington. So I'd like, you know, Lily, to address the whole problem of the resource issue, of what it would cost to win in Ukraine as opposed to hold the 20%. And the other thing with Russia, maybe it's driving the Russians back into an alliance with the Chinese. After all, the whole Nixon-Kissinger thing was to drive a wedge between the Chinese and the Russians, and some of the policies we've been doing has been undoing that. So enough. I'd like to hear what you think.
No, great. Thanks. 2 good questions. 2 good questions. Let me be sure I address both. One is on the resources, and the other is on China-Russia alliance. Okay. On the resources, we've provided the Ukrainians so far about $45 billion in military support. And more on financial and economic support. But just on the military support, about roughly $45 billion. That is about 5% of our defense budget. So our defense budget is $850 billion or so, and that $45 billion is about 5% of our defense budget. For that 5%, the Ukrainians have decimated have cut in half the ground forces of one of the two main adversaries that defense budget is designed for. So that defense budget is designed to protect us, defend us from the Chinese and the Russians, and others as well, of course. But the two big adversaries, the two enemies, and certainly on the Russian side, I'll come back to China. And for 5% of our defense budget, the Ukrainians, without any U.S. military, no soldiers, they have cut in half, have destroyed half of the Russian ground forces. Now let's be clear, not the Air Force and not the Navy, but the ground forces, the Russian ground forces have been destroyed half. For 5%. We can do, the resources are there. The resources are there. We do have other problems. I mean, the people who are concerned about the border have a good point. President Biden recognizes that. He's ready to compromise on that as well, because we recognize that there is a national security interest in having secure borders. We can do this. Again, the magnitude of what we're providing to the Ukrainians compared to our other expenditures suggests that we can do that. On the Chinese, it's a very interesting point. The Chinese are I think, in an uncomfortable position. The Russians have put the Chinese in an uncomfortable position. We remember that just before the big war started, just so in January of 2022, Beijing Olympics, President Putin goes to Beijing and meets with President Xi, and again, this is 3 weeks before the invasion. It's not clear, based on everything that we've been able to put together, it's not clear that President Putin told President Xi he was about to invade. And there is some indication that some Chinese, maybe including President Xi, were irritated with that invasion. Not being told, but also they thought it was a bad idea. Despite requests from the Russians to help to the Chinese, to help them get around sanctions and help them with weapons, the Chinese have said no. Chinese don't want to help get them around. The Chinese have been willing to buy cheap oil and gas from the Russians. That's not getting around sanctions. That's a deal for them. The Indians the same way. But the sanctions, that is the prohibition to provide the Russians with microchips and semiconductors and things that they need to build their weapons again, the Chinese have not been willing to evade those, at least publicly, because they don't want to be sanctioned. The Chinese don't want to be sanctioned. Now, just to be clear, those sanctions, those prohibitions of selling microchips, semiconductors, people get around them. They leak. It's not airtight by any means. But the Chinese have not been supportive on those two issues. And when Putin, for a while, was talking about using nuclear weapons, for a while he was saying, every now and then he would pop off and said, "Don't forget, we've got nuclear weapons," as if we forgot that he had nuclear weapons. He wanted to remind us, and the Chinese, President Xi himself said to President Putin, "Shut up about this. Don't even talk about using nuclear weapons." And President Putin has indeed shut up. He doesn't make that threat anymore, for probably a lot of reasons, but one of them has to be the Chinese. Last thing on this possible Chinese-Russian alliance, which rhetorically is there. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. The rhetoric is there. That same visit that Putin made to Beijing just before the war, they signed a 5,000-word document that promised a partnership without limits between the Russians and the Chinese. Well, there are limits, as we've seen, that the Chinese are not helping them on this. The last thing, the Ukrainians have, about division, the Ukrainians have developed and put out what they call a peace formula. And this is 10 points that they have put out and have tried to build support in the international community for. And these are things like, don't use nuclear weapons and respect sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity. You got basics, environmental concerns. I mean, so they've got these 10 points, peace formula. And they've had 3 now meetings, international meetings, one in Copenhagen, one in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and one in Malta. And they've invited senior people from a lot of countries, as many countries as they could. The Chinese, by the way, the Ukrainians and the Maltese and the Saudi Arabians and the Europeans don't invite the Russians. The Russians are not invited to these conversations. This is to build support for Ukraine, for their peace formula, which the Russians obviously would disagree with, because it would have the Russians pulling out. The Chinese showed up in Jeddah at this senior level. Again, no Russians. Chinese showed up at one of these discussions. The Russians were really not happy that the Chinese participated in this Ukrainian peace formula. This is all to say that this alliance, it's not an alliance, they're not allies, but this association between the Russians and the Chinese is, not solid and is not concrete. They haven't provided things. So that's something that we should keep working on.
We're going to have a lot more questions.
Okay.
But what I'd like to do is have Matthew come up here. Let's get the microphone off of the ambassador. He will linger for a little while here to take other questions. I do have to draw this to a close, unfortunately. It's been a fantastic afternoon. Thank you so much for the engagement. Thank you, sir. It really has been very impressive. Okay, another opportunity for more content from the ambassador is that he did an interview this morning, which will be broadcast tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. on WGCU, our favorite public radio station. So please tune your radios in at 2 p.m. to hear more from Ambassador Taylor. Again, Ambassador Taylor, thank you so much. 90.1 if you don't know where it is. Everybody knows where it is. Have a great Christmas holiday. Happy New Year. We'll see you January 10th, Wednesday, on climate change. Thank you.